from Dr. John Germ. I would be remiss, I think, on this Tuesday of not taking into account the holiday that we celebrated yesterday. And I wish I had had the time to look it up. If Martin Luther King was not a Rotarian, he certainly should have been. He has many, many notable quotes. The one I thought I'd share with you today, because we are together in Rotary, is that he actually said, life's most persistent and urgent question, what are you doing for others? So I think it's the spirit of Rotary for sure, and it's a wonderful quote, I think, at the beginning of a challenging time for our country, and a wonderful one to share with our legislative and executive branch, that the words literally are, what are you doing for others? Not what are you doing to others, or what are you saying about others? So in that spirit, I'm going to try to be as nonpartisan as I can. I know that some of you might have heard in early November our speaker John Francis and I saying, "Go Blue." You might have heard that after the first week in November too, but I need to explain that's something we say that really is nonpartisan. We're both graduates of the University of Michigan, as is John's wife. So in that household and in mine, when we say "Go Blue," we actually don't run the risk, I think, of an internecine quarrel. The other thing that seems very timely to me is that we're in the middle of vetting people for cabinet positions. And interestingly enough, this is a year where we're sometimes looking at people who are not qualified in the traditional sense. And so I thought I would treat John's introduction as a vetting hearing. I thought I'd like to convince you that although it may be a little atypical this year, he is eminently qualified to talk to you today. I think the position I'd be thinking of would be Cabinet Secretary in charge of informed perspective. So a couple things you already know. John actually got his MA and PhD at the University of Michigan, but prior to that, his undergraduate work was at Stanford University and the University of Essex in England. One of his qualifications is holding elective office. And John has been president of the University of Utah Academic Senate. The other one, I think, in terms of perspective, is he's had the opportunity to look at this country from the outside in. He actually held a position as a Canadian visiting scholar in 1986. So he could look down or look south into the United States from a very interesting perspective. He's a member of a group called Law and Society, a group where he's had the chance to present in Minneapolis, Seattle, New Orleans, and Berlin. And in 2017, this year, he's going to be presenting in Mexico. So another very interesting and I think challenging opportunity for an American to be in Mexico looking at the United States. And I wish we could have John back to tell us what we look like from that perspective. Other qualifications include his employment. He has been the Senior Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Utah since 2006 and is a professor of political science at our university. It was very reassuring to me to ride up in an elevator after inviting John to speak to you today. The first person I met said, "I'm so excited to be here today. Dr. Francis is my favorite professor of all of the professors I've ever had at the University of Utah." In terms of his fields, once again, relevant and qualified. There are comparative politics, Western European and North American and British politics, and public policy, regulation, federalism, and health policy. John has edited a book called David Cameron and Conservative Renewal, The Limits of Modernization, just recently published by Manchester University Press. I hope I've made the case that you will approve of our choice for our Speaker and Secretary of Informed Perspective, John Francis.
Well, that was very nice. I'm not sure that I'll get into the Trump cabinet, but I'm grateful for the recommendation. But I also want, before I begin to offer my brief remarks, to say that I am very grateful to be here at Rotary for another reason, and that many years ago, let's say a very long time ago, I had a Rotary scholarship and spoke quite often in Britain at Rotary clubs. And so I have always had fond affection for Rotary and all that it has done and continues to do. So I'm going to really talk about this. Should American security policy change in a changing Europe? And over the past 60 years, there's been a great deal of continuity in American security policy toward Europe. In fact, it's been one of our major fixed points. But we are now probably on the cusp of seeing that change. And what does that mean, and how do we look at it, is what I hope to speak about. And I'll do that in 3 sections. All academics always give things in 3 sections. First, I'll observe 3 competing and recurring approaches to security that we have adopted over the years in this country. Then I'll briefly discuss our existing European security policy, and finally, I'll talk about the challenges to that policy. So first, 3 approaches. And these approaches are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes they all go on in our country, but they tend to emphasize or tend to characterize how we think about security. The first approach, maybe going back to Washington, which is, I'm glad the nice person spoke about Washington, is that we should concentrate on securing our borders, and that our security begins at the water's edge. The goal is to have a military force that can deter or defeat foreign enemies from invading this country. In other words, we put our resources here in the American homeland. That's what Washington said about no entangling alliances. Large chunks of the 19th century and parts of and certainly in the 1920s and 1930s in American life. So focus on the homeland, build up our resources, our forces to keep out possible alien attacks or enemy attacks. The second approach, one that prevailed after the Second World War and perhaps up to this time, I would describe as very different. It is argued that the defense of the United States is best achieved by a series of strategic alliances in other parts of the globe, notably Europe. And that approach has really emphasized that we don't look just at the water's edge. We look at the perimeter of our security in Europe. That's the example I'm using in this talk. And that's where we may encounter the enemy, not on the shores of North Carolina, but in the threat that we saw from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We saw that threat traded in Europe. So in alliances, many of which, of course, we've sustained all around the globe. Third is an approach that you can closely associate with President Jefferson, with Woodrow Wilson, with General Marshall, and that is the best protection for the United States is to export our democratic values and human rights concerns to other countries. That is to have them share the same values that we share. There is a theme in the political science literature that says, democracies never fight other democracies. And that's largely true. And the argument is if more people shared common values, we would have less risk to the world. So none of these approaches preclude the other, but they tend to characterize how people feel in any particular administration. So now I want to essentially talk about our existing European security policy and what it has been. And I argue that it really begins in the aftermath of the Second World War. And we essentially made the point that Europe is where we wanted to concentrate our efforts and endeavors. And we devised a policy, our security policy in Europe, that rested on 2 pillars. One is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the other is the European Union, which essentially was strongly encouraged by the United States. We didn't form it, the Europeans did, but we did all in our power to encourage its formation. So the United States formed NATO in 1949 and encouraged the formation of the European Union in the early 1950s. And NATO is, of course, a military alliance that was formed to block the Soviet advance into Western Europe. From day one to the present day, we have assumed a great deal of the expense of NATO. We've largely funded it. Not all of it, by any measure, but a chunk of it. In the early years of the European Union, we saw the emergence of a trade and political organization designed to facilitate economic growth and to promote political cooperation and to end conflict within Europe. That was our goal. This made, over time, the EU, the European Union, succeeded. It became a formidable new form of international political expression. It became, in fact, is one of our largest trading partners. And unlike many of our other trading partners, the level trade is about the same on both sides. That is, we don't export tons more to them or they to us. So today, what about these two pillars? Well, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has 28 countries, but some NATO countries like Albania, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Turkey, and the United States are not members of the European Union. The NATO Charter requires that NATO promotes democratic values, but its core mission is the agreement that an attack against any one or several members of the alliance is an attack against all. So whether you're in Lithuania or Portugal, the requirement is if they're attacked, we're all attacked. The European Union has also 28 members, but that includes Austria, Cyprus, Finland, Ireland, Malta, and Sweden, who are essentially not members of NATO. It has grown from 6 to 28 members since 1956. You can only belong to the EU if you are a democratic country. If you are not, you're not supposed to belong. But the end of the Cold War raised two questions. Was there any reason still to keep NATO? The answer was apparently yes, because it expanded east and took up a number of countries that used to be under Soviet control. The second question was, should the EU expand? And of course it did, dramatically, getting and recruiting nearly all the former Soviet bloc countries. So these are both, as a result of the Cold War, both NATO and the European Union expanded. But the optimism of the 1990s, when this expansion began for both of these organizations, has faded a bit, with recurring uncertainty as to NATO's role and the challenges confronting the EU. The European Union is a complex organization. It makes even American federalism look simple in comparison. It has many different layers, it has many different presidents, but it still, in large measure, functions. It is confronting another challenge for the first time in its history. Britain is narrowly voted, to leave the EU, and that is a prolonged set of negotiations that will go on for 2 years. And it's not clear exactly how they will turn out. But nonetheless, that's a challenge. In general, I think that it will slow the process of political integration in Europe, but it's unlikely at this stage that anyone else will leave. So, what has the EU achieved? 60 years, countries in Western and Central Europe have not gone to war with one another. It is the longest period of peace in Europe among major powers for the past 250 years. This is a remarkable achievement and should not be underestimated. But there is, and the EU has achieved a great deal in sustaining its values and in maintaining a high standard of living. But there is a problem for the EU. And here is the problem. The EU has done a good job at economic integration. It's done a reasonable job at essentially spreading its values among its member states. It has helped keep a domestic peace. But on terms of security, in terms of dealing with threats from others, it is in an awkward position. For that is provided by NATO, not by Europe. And NATO is an Atlantic institution under American leadership. So let me give you an example of what this means. And I'll use the refugee example and the migrant example. So, as you all know, as we all know from reading the papers, seeing television, millions of people have been displaced in North Africa and in Syria in particular, given the horror of that war. These millions want to go to Europe. In fact, over 1 million have gone to Europe. But the Europeans are increasingly skeptical or doubtful or unwilling to admit new refugees into their country, into their set of countries. Now, all that may be understandable one way or the other, but what is fascinating about all this is that in any discussions in the Middle East concerning Syria, concerning a number of other Middle East problems, the one voice you do not see represented is Europe. Europe is unable to project its military power, because it doesn't have much unless it's through NATO, into the Middle East or to other spheres. In other words, the part of the world most confronting a flow of migrants and refugees is the part of the world that is unable to provide for its own projection of military power, if all that makes sense. So the question then is, what happens next? The European leaders are frankly increasingly uncertain as to the nature of the American commitment to European security. European leaders are aware that they are at a moment in a very vulnerable situation. If NATO were to weaken or to be displaced or essentially no longer around, how would they handle the nature of their security problems? That is a source of concern, whether you're in Berlin or Paris or the Netherlands or Spain. It is a major consideration. So now, if I've given you that kind of approach there, I want to now talk about how we, the United States, is thinking about NATO and thinking about the EU and what are the implications. Thinking back to the campaign we just had, two of the major candidates in the primary season judged NATO to be an institution that depends too much on American money. It is suggested that the Europeans should take care of more of their own defense. And that was Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, who had very similar views on NATO. They have argued, as have other Americans, that over the years, by spending money overseas on alliances, we have deprived expenditure that is needed here at home. Followed by the fact that American public opinion is increasingly skeptical of our overseas military interventions, particularly over the past 16 years. They're judged as having mixed results. This is a view that's shared that somehow we should focus more on the domestic focus. So this is leading to an era now that conceivably will go back to that first approach I talked about, an approach that essentially says, let's extract ourselves from alliances, let us focus on what we need to focus on here at home, continue to sustain and build our military prowess here at home, but be less involved in our alliances with others. So that's the kind of set of situations that we now confront. So what happens next? First of all, I must immediately state that political science is much better at post-diction than it is at prediction. In other words, I can't necessarily tell you what's going to happen next because I certainly don't know. But here are 3 scenarios that may take place. See if this works. 2 of these scenarios suggest a removed role for the United States in Europe, but one suggests that we stay in Europe. So one approach is to rebuild and reinvigorate NATO, to have it play a more vigorous role, to have it take on a joint Atlantic role that seems to be in everyone's interest. It's not clear to me how this would be done, but that would be one goal, to say, even though things have changed since 1949, there's some reasons to keep this close American-European collaboration. The second approach, one that has a lesser role for the United States, is that the European Union build an effective armed force capable of intervening outside of Europe. To actually create essentially a general command. You go to Germany and someone says, where is the high command? They won't be able to give you any advice because they don't have a high command because of the reasons we all know very clearly. They didn't establish one. So you essentially have to integrate a lot of separate navies and armies and air forces in some more coherent way than is done now. This can be done. They have the technology, they have the personnel, but it takes a while and it is costly to do. So a second is Europe develops its own forces and becomes a player in its own region, particularly if it perceives Russia as a threat, and many Europeans do. The third is a very different approach. And this is an approach that says that the European Union strikes a deal with Putin. To the extent that and essentially says there is a Russian sphere of influence. The question is, how big is that Russian sphere of influence? How far would it embrace? How many countries? Putin has the military force, Europe has the money. So what kind of arrangement would that be? You might say, well, that's a fantasy. And I certainly hope it's a fantasy. But one of the leading candidate for the French presidency, a man named Fillon, has essentially said that he will strike a deal with Putin if elected. So one of the things that we'll probably have to give some thought to is, what are our goals? Should we remain in Europe as an active force? Is it better to think our perimeter of defense being there? Is it better to say, you, Europe, come up with your own force, take care of your own responsibilities? Or leave it to the Europeans to reach their own accommodation with the Russian threat? So I'm not saying that any of these things will occur, but I'm thinking that as we reflect on a very changed position that seems to be emerging, at least with President-elect Trump, where he thinks the EU is going to fall apart, and he is worried, and he thinks NATO is obsolete, as he said just a couple of days ago. And I think he enjoys being provocative, so it doesn't necessarily mean that he holds to these positions. But it does suggest that we now have on the table more dramatically in the past, thinking through our approach and what we should be trying to do with the European sphere, with Europe, and how we're going to approach our relationship with them, which will lead to a major change, or could lead to a major change over what we've had in the past. So those are my comments. I deliberately tried to set that up, that if there are questions, I have the opportunity to answer them for you. Thank you very much. And do I call the questions, or do you?
If you would repeat the question, that would be great. And I think you're fine recognizing the question.
I'll begin right here, sir.
Thank you. What is your prognosis, or what are your feelings about Great Britain now that they're apparently leaving the Union? Where do you see them heading? Is it a positive move?
Okay, well, I think it's a complicated move. It's a major argument that it's good. The British, as everyone knows, does not have a written constitution, which means you get to do nearly anything you want, right? And so that means if you have a referendum, but only a plurality of the actual electorate supported it, it always makes me a little nervous that you shouldn't have constitutional change without having a higher bar to achieve it. So I'll leave that as a thought that's made me nervous. Can Britain survive without being in the EU? I think so. And if I were to speculate a great deal, remember Prime Minister May plans to visit Washington in May. So Prime Minister May is coming in May to visit there. She's gone out of her way to be very supportive of President-elect Trump. And the one approach that the British are now discussing, and I'm not sure it's going to happen, is that Britain joins NAFTA, the North American Free Trade. So then you have Mexico, Canada, the US, and UK. I mean, it's an unusual combination, but essentially, she's toying with ideas to think about how you still maintain Britain as an economic trading power, given that half of its trade is with the EU. So it's solvable. They have 2 years to do it if they stick with the agreement to formally leave in March. Remember, Britain hasn't left yet. They only voted to leave. So the question is, how do they make that work? And there is a discussion. They will soon sign. They can sign an agreement with New Zealand. I love New Zealand. Great place, but it's not a major trading power, right? So it's going to take some thought to make that work. And the greatest risk for the British is 12% of the economy has to do with financial services. And if that were to move to Frankfurt or to Paris, as the French would deeply hope, that would be very hard, I think, for the British. That would be at least a great dislocation. So if I've answered that. Sir.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to repeat the question. Go ahead.
Ukraine, wasn't it a defective Soviet sphere, and then it got carried away with the NATO conditions, and didn't that cause the Russian,
Yeah,
and so forth?
Yeah. So the question is essentially what to do with the Ukraine, which it's essentially was in the Soviet sphere, and before then was in the Tsarist sphere, right? So and what happens and what occurred. So the Ukrainian crisis was actually immediately provoked by a trade deal that was on the table with the European Union and the Ukraine, which led some people in the Kremlin, so the story goes, to say that something must be done and to kind of secure at least a part of the Ukraine, because they saw that as a threat. I think the Ukrainian issue is one that's very hard, because once it took place, the only country that conceivably could intervene would be the United States, and that has caused a great debate in this country over what that would mean and how that should be extended. So I think it's an example of Europe wanting to continue to play an easterly role, but lacking in many respects the resources to sustain that. The kind of related question would be that you may know American troops have gone to Poland. If you go to the Baltic countries, like Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, there is great concern in those countries. In fact, 2 years ago, I was on an evaluation team for the military academy in Lithuania. And I asked them what their plan was in case of attack, and they said, we can last for 24 hours. which is not a warmly encouraging amount of time, right? So it has, so I think they would much love to have an American presence there. The question is that something that we all want to do? Sir?
Could you briefly describe the military structure of NATO? Do they have troops? Who commands them? What goes on?
Yeah, so there's the Secretary General of NATO, which is nearly always a European. Then there's an American commander, and you essentially there's a response in case of attack that's been worked out among the NATO allies. There are regular efforts to prepare and to practice for such an event. There have been efforts to use NATO troops in other contexts. So even though these are all separate countries with their own military, there's now, since 1949, a long tradition of coordinated response. Though I went out of my way to say, and I should maybe have made this clearer than I did in my remarks, that one way to think about Europe is that we help fund their defense. I don't dispute it. The interesting question is, why do we do it? And the argument often made is that Americans are prepared to defend Europe because we would rather defend Europe in Europe than to have an attack on our own country. That makes sense. So that it's worth it to subsidize the defense. That's the darker realist view of this claim, that the perimeter is there, not here, on that way, if I've answered that question. Yes?
So that leads to my question. Why haven't we not been able to get Europe to take over a bigger percentage of the funding of that?
It's I think the Europeans, I think there are probably a couple of reasons. One, we have always been quite willing to do it. I think if we turned the screws a bit more, they probably would pay more. And in fairness, that and when calculating the cost, I was looking at more explicit costs. But a lot of the weaponry used in many parts of Europe are supplied by American military manufacturers. So often that's actually helped our own industry, not necessarily our taxpayers directly, but indirectly, if that makes sense. So there's been some hesitation around all that, although a major military supplier are the French historically, and a number of other places as well. And there's also a close relationship sometimes between commercial air power and military air power. You can kind of see that with Airbus and its rivalry here. Oops, yeah, yes, Matt.
It sort of seems to me that this very elaborate worldwide structure that was established after World War II, and you are talking about the NATO part and the European part, but isn't it also happening in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, that all these treaties are looking to be refreshed or dismantled? Do you have any, I know that's not your field, but is my hunch correct that it's happening other places?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Did everyone hear that question?
No.
Okay. So the question is essentially, I've been focused on Europe, but what about treaty obligations we have in other parts of the globe, and what are going to happen to those treaties? Is that a fair statement? And as you pointed out, that's not my field, and my wife is an attorney. As soon as I ask her a legal question, she says, that's not my field. So, but I think the kind of question here is a serious one, because in general, we are a major North Asian power, right? We are, the United States is a strong presence there. We are a presence in, less of a strong presence, but in Southeast Asia. And I think if we probably see those alliances as a similar perimeter begins to kind of constantly reassess the Chinese threat. I mean, economically, Russia's not much compared to China, right? But militarily, it's still quite a significant presence. So the question is, do we want to keep that presence in Southeast Asia? So I think that's very much on the table, and that probably one has to figure out what that would mean and the implications of sustaining that alliance. But you're right, that's still part of that old model that was established in Europe, but exported to other parts of the globe. Sir.
Listening to this last campaign that went on, it sounded to me like one of the possibilities in the future is, rather than building all the military, that our newly elected president might take an approach to sit down and see if he can't make agreements, particularly with the Russian leader, Putin. Is that a possibility, and what might happen?
I think, yes. So the question is that the president-elect, given the campaign, seemed to suggest that he could reach his own agreement with Putin. You may recall just the other day he said that he raised the idea of removing essentially the sanctions on Russia if Russia agreed to reduce their nuclear stockpile. And I think the way the Russians responded was that the leaders of the two houses of the said, no, we don't think that's a good idea at this time. So I think, yes, I think that is very much in the notion of creating a Russian sphere and say, okay, this is your area, this is our area, why are we worrying about this, right? So I think there's some thought there. I think actually one of the things that I'd keep in mind, though, is that the Secretary-designate of Defense, and I think this was also actually true of the Secretary-designate of State, are both people whose views don't quite coincide with President Trump's views as I understand them. So I think it's going to be, a lot hinges on the style of governance that we see going forward. Will state and defense have more of their own role in shaping our policy, or will that flow from the White House? And I don't know the answer to that question. Let me go to that gentleman, and then I'll go to Bob. Yes?
So we know from history that monetary unions and currency unions don't necessarily have long lives. If there were to be a political military union, do you think that it could be stronger than a currency and monetary union, especially with regards to the Brexit idea of what if someone eventually wants to leave?
Yeah, well, I think there's no doubt about it. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, the question is, how do we compare monetary unions and political unions to defense unions? How do they connect? Are they the same? And and then this really relates to the future of the euro. And in general, I think, I would guess that the euro has quite a reasonable chance of surviving. I think but it has a better chance of surviving if it is less under the leadership of the German central bank than it is at the moment. And I think that, as you may have noted, the country that has suffered enormously these last few years is Greece. What is it, 20% decline in their economy? And one of the things you don't hear is what? We're leaving the euro tomorrow, right? That's been very hard to achieve. I think they actually would gain some if the European Union would be a bit stronger if it had something resembling more of its own sense of its own security than it has now. But the terrorist attacks in France generated questions over whether still Europeans are sharing all the information they should be sharing. So I think they haven't given as much thought to some of the security questions. I don't think that precludes the American alliance, but it requires that they give more thought than they have. I've answered your question. Bob.
John, coming quickly back to Brexit. You alluded to it very briefly, but the notion that leaving the Union cannot be handled simply with a referendum or an advisory referendum, but needs to be accomplished through an act of Parliament. Does that have any legs?
Yes, it does have legs. In fact, I was about 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting with a number of British lawyers who work on this, and they believe that the British Supreme Court will rule on behalf, and this will be a good way of testing whether not predictive powers make any sense at all, that that will require that that Parliament vote on the question, arguing that belonging to the EU is a domestic issue, not a foreign and defense policy issue. And if that happens, that means that's a constraint on the government, because at the moment, the majority of people in the House of Commons would prefer to stay in. I mean, I think they understand that they'll be leaving, but they would want a soft Brexit, not a hard Brexit.
Okay. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
I don't know about you, but I feel a lot smarter. We're going to ask John to sign Sam and Dave Dig a Big Hole. Linda does a great job of picking our books. And our next meeting is next week. Anybody remember where we're going next week? Joseph Smith Memorial Building. And what are we doing?
Eating lunch.
Lake Powell. Lake Powell next week. All righty. I'm glad someone here is paying attention. All righty, we're adjourned.
And do I